Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another great episode of Britannian Times Live. All right, so interesting times. I hear there's an election going on or something. Anyways, I didn't care enough to vote, so I have a recurring guest coming on. We're bringing back Garth T. Ogle, but this time under very exciting circumstances. I'm sure you see the banner back here, but his book did actually come out. We debuted it at Doxacon 2018, which was beyond expectations. It was great. The level of discourse that the keynote speakers gave blew me away. I didn't realize that science fiction fans were so intellectual. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but the discussions about Dune and C.S. Lewis, they were on another level. It's good stuff. I really enjoyed it, and we sold a lot of books. Actually, 20% of the attendees purchased The Bowl of Tears and Solace. Anyways, let me go ahead and give Garth a call. Hello.
Hello.
Is this the famous author, Garth T. Ogle?
Good to be here.
Well, hey, good to have you on again. I think you've set a record. It's what, the fourth time?
Oh, wow.
Well, no, it's only your second time.
Yep.
But it feels like the fourth.
It's because my presence must be.
That's what happens when you're in the midst of the greatest author of all space and time.
All right.
Yeah. So what do you I know I just mentioned to the audience that we were at Doxacon this past weekend. What's your initial reaction to that?
Well, I wasn't sure what to think. I'd never been to a small convention, and certainly not a sort of convention that combined things that are explicitly religious with something like science fiction and fantasy. I mean, those, at least in terms of fantasy, that combination is pretty old, but I'd never been to a convention of that sort, so I wasn't really sure what to expect. But I was pleasantly surprised. It was a very fun convention. It wasn't, sometimes large conventions can get kind of stuffy and, very, I don't know what the best word for it is. They have a lot of people to shuffle around, and, they have more security issues. So people aren't as friendly at those conventions, but everyone was very friendly. It was very, I guess very close at hand. I don't know the best way to describe it. And it was, and all of the talks, because, we weren't in the convention halls with 300 people, there was something more intimate about all of the talks. And you obviously had a greater chance of actually talking to a person that you were interested in speaking to. So, and it wasn't as though the people who spoke there were not, really good at what they did. They certainly were. So it was a very interesting combination that you don't often see.
Yeah, I was a little surprised by the level of, the intellectual level that the conversations took. It just wasn't what I was expecting with something based around science fiction.
Yeah, I mean, usually these sort of fandom type conventions are very surface. They're more about, I don't know the best way to put it. I've been to Otakon before, for example, and Otakon is very, you would never see a discussion of great man theory at Otakon. I mean, I don't know for sure that there hasn't ever been one, but the Otakon I went to, there wasn't really this kind of philosophical or political history discussion that would ever seem to come up in anything.
Yeah. Well, I do kind of want to, I guess, do our own little mini version of that, kind of rehashing some of the main points that we encountered because I thought they were interesting. But let's start with, so what is so good? Why do we love science fiction so much?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this ourselves when we were at the convention, and I think there was some discussion of it as well. And science fiction deals with themes that, well, so my view on the subject is that both science fiction and fantasy are forms of myth. They're primarily mythical, and science fiction talks about the future usually, but does not necessarily, but usually. And it talks about technology, and it explores questions of ethics and morals and so on and so forth. And these are things that need to be said and looked at. But usually science fiction has a implicitly or explicitly secular viewpoint, which means that one of the most common conceits of science fiction is that as technology increases, so man becomes more advanced in the progressive viewpoint. So in the same way that some of the Marxists thought that as Marxism increased, the government would wither away. So the science fiction writer of the 20th century has a conceit that as technology increases, religion will wither away. So you have these hyper-futuristic societies where religion has basically disappeared. And it's not apparent from the story that it has actually been replaced with anything, which is often a little bit of a hole in the believability of the story, although those topics, many times, even in ancient literature, like descriptions of religious practice and so forth, don't always even enter into the story, even though, of course, we know that in that time they practiced religion. So you can get away with depicting a story without showing religion explicitly. And so I think to some extent they get away with this because of that. But there are points in the stories where they try to make a point that religion no longer exists in these contexts, and it's because, they believe that technology will sort of obviate a need for religious practice, which is probably false. And there's I can think of a couple of reasons or a couple of things that are wrong with this, but science fiction does still function as a form of myth about the future. And it arises, I think, in the 20th century as a sort of extension of the kind of budding fantastical genres that show up in the 19th century, as a kind of expansion of this into the future, especially when the scientific exploration, such as Darwin, things like this, really started to enter the public imagination. People really started to think about technology, and they really started to think about what would happen as a result of the technology. And so not merely thinking about, so one of the older topics of stories was, for example, explorations. There are Robert Louis Stevenson stories about this. Gulliver's Travels is a kind of sort of a parody on this traditional genre. And this was the idea of when you went out into these places that had yet to be explored, what would you find? And so science fiction sort of starts out as this exploration into the future where technology has been developed. And the perfect place to start, I mean, there are some ancient sort of science fiction-y stories like The Dream. It's a really old one. But I believe the one that most people recognize as sort of the father of the genre is Frankenstein's Monster, which sort of posits this first kind of imaginative technological fusion where they ask the question, if you could create a human out of body parts with nothing but technology, what would the result be? And so it's a sort of exploration into a possible future. And it's mythical.
Yeah. So would you say that the ideas that science fiction typically perpetuate is just kind of just really the prevalent kind of utopian ideas that are being pushed in society in general?
Yes, I think that science fiction does one of two things. It either affirms, well, a good example is if you look at Aldous Huxley's work. He has essentially two different stories. One is called The Island, which is not well known, and the other is called Brave New World, which is well known. And both of these are sort of psychosocial science fiction rather than technological or hard or futurist science fiction. And the dichotomy between the two is that in Brave New World, it's dystopian, but it still affirms the same worldview, whereas The Island is utopian. It still affirms the same worldview in the sense that it's sort of like you have the same set of ideas as predictions for the future, and in one scenario, those predictions produce something bad, and in the other scenario, they produce something good. But it's the same underlying set of beliefs, and the distinction, for example, made between Brave New World and The Island is that in Brave New World, the technologies that they employ result in essentially people being enslaved, whereas in The Island, it results in them being free. But it's really the same conceit. It's drugs, it's, social manipulation, these sort of things.
So, I mean, I think you said they either do one or two things. What were you getting at there?
Either they're utopian or they're dystopian.
Oh, I gotcha.
But usually the substantive difference between the utopia and the dystopia isn't great. In that you could have two authors essentially exploring the same future, and one of them sees it as dystopian or looks at the potential dystopian aspects of it, whereas the other author is looking primarily at the utopian aspects of it. But what you are really seeing is the same basic belief about the future.
Okay.
Now, this is not uniformly true at this point. I think that I think one of the books that was brought up was Dune, so that doesn't necessarily fit into that. And there are some unusual entries early on, like The Worm Ouroboros, which is a sort of science fiction story that turns into a fantasy story. And there's a number of them like that. But the most famous and prominent examples all seem to follow this pattern.
Okay. Well, I suspect you may bring up something that you just mentioned, but with that in mind of what's typical, what strikes you as the most interesting and enjoyable in science fiction?
Well, I think, in my view, I like explorations of how a new technology or something affects human behavior, and how ultimately technologies end up being subsumed by the same forces that have always subsumed technologies. Like say political forces, for example, social forces, and how even though a great power or a great technology, which could potentially throw off the balance of power, in a country or even in the whole world, arises, yet some kind of ordinary human foible gets in the way, and things become, normalcy in some way returns. But a good example of this trope is, I don't know if you remember, I'm trying to remember the name of that movie. I think it's War Games. So the one where he finds the computer and he doesn't realize that the computer is hooked up to the actual missile system. And so it's a combination of this technology where he can launch nukes across the world through this computer, which, by the way, the nukes were never that easy to launch. But that's another key conceit often in a science fiction story, is that the technologies are not always realistically represented. And but he doesn't realize he can launch nukes, and so he starts playing around with the computer, and he almost starts a nuclear war. So, but it's, there's a combination of these amazing technologies and these ordinary humans, and underneath it all, there is often an understanding that even as the technologies increase and improve and become more complex, you still have the same humans. And I think this has led some people to believe that you're going to need something beyond the human, which I think is part of where transhumanism arises out of, because people are seeing these massive flows of information that are near incomprehensible, and they're thinking, well, humans are very limited and they have all these social issues and things like that, and we're going to need something better to handle this. And I actually don't think that's true. I don't think that that's really a feasible thing to have. I don't know that that's really possible, at least not the way they're thinking of it. And what always ends up happening is, no matter what you design, like even as an artificial intelligence, it always ends up having an element of human in it, which is always its weakness.
Yeah, the whole AI thing, well, the transhuman thing, not AI, but it just makes me think of the Borg.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are some interesting explorations into what are essentially transhuman solutions, and the most sort of faithful representations of them, in my view, are the ones where even though they have these certain superhuman qualities, ultimately something about them is still human, and they still have this particularly human weakness, which is always a fascinating angle. And I think in some of the stories of the Borg, that still does come up, how the members in the Borg may be part of this hive, but they're still humans. So,
yeah, Star Trek is the epitome of what you were describing in the beginning of the show, but it's like I hate it and I love it at the same time.
Yeah, and I think the original Star Trek is very interesting in that it alone of all of them is closest to its origins in sort of like weird fiction pulp stuff, and because it still is a little campy. Like Next Generation is not nearly as campy, and Deep Space Nine and so forth, Voyager, all those, they sort of reduce the campiness a lot. But the first one, you can kind of see it's sort of this weird, jaunty, like futurist, liberal fantasy kind of thing. And it's interesting because the first Star Trek is kind of liberal internationalist in character, and then the Next Generation is sort of a weird quasi-communist thing, and then Deep Space Nine is, I guess because it's a frontier, it has a completely different underlying assumption. And I don't remember what it was with Voyager. I just didn't pay much attention to that, honestly, when I watched it.
Voyager was, I enjoyed Voyager, but they were just kind of lost in some really far away from home, and it was like all new encounters with new species, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't remember much about the politics of the Federation really coming into.
Yeah, I don't think it really fit the story that much. So, but there was a lot of character development, and it didn't seem as politicky.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why Star Trek, in particular, was such a popular series over time is because even though it's sort of this, it has that same idea of no religion and you're in this super hyper technological future, yet they still end up in the same situation, which I was talking about, which is that everything ends up being, to some degree, a character drama, because all of the technologies are in the hands of humans or things like humans, and so you end up with the same conflicts.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of conflict for people that have no need for currency anymore.
Yeah. I mean, some of the presuppositions within, and I guess it's sort of the problem of the faithful storyteller when the faithful storyteller wants to impress an ideology upon the world that's sort of artificial. If he's faithful in storytelling, he finds it very difficult to maintain his sort of bias or slant. Eventually, the sort of machinations of real human relationships catch up with him, and he ends up depicting the truth, whether he likes it or not.
Okay. So what's your favorite science fiction? Before we get into your work, what is your absolute favorite?
My absolute favorite was definitely C.S. Lewis's The Space Trilogy. And I don't know if anyone has mentioned this to you, but apparently, this is what I heard, Tolkien and Lewis, of course, they both wrote fantasy, and Lewis wrote a lot of apologetics and stuff. And they made some kind of deal with one another. And I don't know who started it, but the deal that they came up with was that they would each write a science fiction. And Lewis was going to write a science fiction of traveling through space, and Tolkien was going to write a science fiction traveling through time. We never got Tolkien's time travel, but the legend is that he was going to tell a time travel story where people traveled back through their bloodline.
Wow.
So that would have been, it's a shame that we never got that story, because I'm sure that would have been really, really crazy. Better than anything we see today.
How do you get to middle blood?
I don't know how you travel back through your bloodline exactly, but I'm sure he would have come up with something. But the Space Trilogy is my favorite because it sort of it encompasses, or it really gets back to the mythic quality. And a lot of the earlier science fiction was a little more in contact with that. At least if you think about, say, Lovecraft, it's definitely more mythology than it is hard science fiction. And then Burns, of course, is the closest to being like what we would call hard science fiction, in the sense of trying to really work through what a technology would be like. And what's interesting about Burns is that his stories did pretty much come true.
What would you like to see more of in science fiction in general?
Well, first of all, I haven't read recent science fiction as much as I read the sort of golden age science fiction when I was younger. My father had a full collection of the laser books, which were either republishings or it was sort of like a series for budding or, sort of famous science fiction authors to publish short length, not too long stories. And I have no idea how many I read of those. But science fiction today, as far as I understand it, is a little bit obsessed with things like diversity or alienness, these sort of things. A good example is this recent movie called The Shape of Water, where it's about this romance between a woman and a fish man. And I mean, there can be interesting things in these stories, but there appears to be a kind of obsession with that right now. And I think there are a lot of sort of more existential or ontological questions, things that, like, Philip K. Dick, for example, was trying to examine his sort of cosmically broken way. These sort of questions concerning, like, for example, what is a human? And not in the sense of, well, if an alien looks like a human, it's a human, or if an alien can talk and think, it's a human. More on the very rudimentary level of, you know, this is the question that comes up in Blade Runner, right? Is an android, can an android ever actually be a human? Or is it always just a homunculus or a simulacra of humans?
You know that this question is explored quite a bit in Star Trek,
Mhm.
like
Yes,
the
in fact,
holograms and the robot. What's his name? Data.
Data.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is interesting because he is a unique being. So they kind of get around some of the other. They kind of don't really address some of it because they don't quite have the metaphysics. There's a kind of a flat metaphysics where the typical flat metaphysics answer for intelligence or consciousness is the one that Heinlein gave in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which was the idea that if you had a integrated system of some kind that was complex enough, it would acquire consciousness. And I think that Heinlein wasn't necessarily, I don't know how serious he was being with that. It was simply, it was a little bit on the level of Lovecraft, where it's less about whether or not it's technically feasible and more about the fact that it's sort of weird. And it's kind of, you know, like, well, what if that really did happen? And, you know, it's not really explicable. But his sort of story about this inexplicable system on the moon becoming conscious sort of became this go-to pat answer that people would give about consciousness, when I don't know that it was originally intended that way. But it's because they have a flat metaphysics, they sort of fall back on that. Like with Data, it's like, well, he's just a very complicated computer. And because he's complex enough and he's human-shaped, and he has all of these feedbacks and stuff, and he's been trained to be like a human, he sort of is eventually human. And there's no question really about souls. And so I think that the metaphysical questions just don't get asked. And there are definitely some authors during the golden age of science fiction. I guess there was that guy Lafferty that one of the speakers brought up, who actually tried to delve into these questions from a religious perspective. But and I'm sure that there are science fiction authors today that actually have, you know, done these things. Like I said, I haven't read any recent science fiction, but the science fiction that I read when I was growing up, which was primarily golden age science fiction, almost completely ignores these issues. And the Star Trek series tend to ignore them as well. And when they confront them, they tend to confront them with a flat metaphysics. There's no sort of spiritual hierarchy in the invisible elemental places, if you will. I mean, the closest you get to it is Lovecraft, which is weird, but I mean, even when you're dealing with, but that's where like the space trilogy comes in, right? It actually does start to delve into these questions, especially the second novel, Paralandra, actually begins to get into a metaphysics concerning alien life. And that's really sort of the science fiction trope, if you will, that's being explored on the planet Venus. And it's the idea of, well, so in Star Trek, I don't think they never really addressed the issue as to why all of the alien races are basically humans with weird foreheads. I mean, it kind of makes sense as a trope just because it's very easy to stage act that.
Yeah, well, I think the criteria was they would always point to intelligence as the criteria as to what counts as a
they call them sentient beings?
Yep, yeah, sentient. I think it was the intelligence level.
Yeah, but they always end up sort of like humans, which is, I mean, ultimately, like I said, its origins are in pulp. And so, and actually, you know, there are occasionally, and I think in the original Star Trek, there were, to some degree, more of these really weird non-human intelligences. like things that were just like a crystal that was intelligent or something like that. I think there was
Yeah, they pop up in the next generation in Voyager 2.
But they're usually sort of monstrous. In a
Yeah.
really bizarre and sort of murderous way.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that. I mean, I'm not sure if it may just be playing on like, you know, it's playing on the audience expectation more than it is, in a way, sort of exploring the questions more deeply. And I think that it takes a bit of skill as a writer to explore a deep question while at the same time not alienating your audience.
Yeah. Well, as we know, last Friday, Bowl of Tears and Solace, written by yourself, was released at Doxacon.
Yes.
What ideas and so I guess what is the underlying theme and the ideas that you tried to implement into this work?
Well, it's about classical spirituality in the context of what you would call like a high technological future. So classical spirituality in the context of a high technological future. And some issues of things like suffering, so the Odyssey, I guess, why is there evil, do come up in the story. And the story certainly is primarily about that question as it regards a particular technology that's invented, a medical technology. But the themes are also about sort of like a psychological realism. So attempting to depict people's psychology realistically, while at the same time, sometimes when we get into psychological realism, we end up with, well, I think one of the pet tropes of later comic books was to attempt to make their characters flawed, which is a sort of crude attempt at psychological realism where you're like, okay, so you have a hero, but if the hero is perfect like Superman, it gets kind of boring. There's not a whole lot of drama that you can create. And so we're going to make him a drunkard or something. And like, yeah, I mean, that does create some conflict. But the idea is what are these sort of inner spiritual conflicts that people have, and how many layers do people have of being sympathetic on the one hand, but also sort of base and kind of and sometimes disgusting. So you have a
based
and red pill, but oh no, you did it. Oh no, you brought out the base bear. But this theme of psychological realism is very important because it leads to a world where, and I think this is true in some science fiction settings as well, but it's not that it's a black-gray world. So one of the tropes, that's a term from TV tropes. It's just an easy way to talk about it. A black-gray world is where you have a world where basically everyone's evil, but some people are not really evil. They're just out for their own, right? And so in that world, something's called a black-gray world. I mean, a good example of a setting that lends itself to being black-gray, even though it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be played that way, is Warhammer 40K. So basically, all of the factions are something that's sort of horrible. But there are some things that are not ridiculously horrible, only horrible and cool, right? So, so there's a risk that you get into a black-gray setting where you basically make everyone evil, which is not really correct, because in classical storytelling, in a tragedy, everyone is supposed to actually be slightly better people than you would expect. And so in a black-gray setting, you kind of lose that because everyone is sort of wicked. And then, I mean, you're at that point, you pretty much have to write a comedy, and no one does. So to me, it's sort of, it doesn't have that snap to me. But so you have to start out with this idea of these people of virtue, and then you have to figure out, well, what is their real psychology? Why are they really doing what they do? What are the complexities of their motivations? Why? What's their history? What are the stories that themselves within the story form their reasons for particular conflicts? And how does that eventually bear out in the conflicts that happen in the story? And I think, I don't remember if it was Thomas Reimer who said that people essentially desire two things out of a story. And he was referring, of course, in his case to stage plays, but it's true of all stories. They desire spectacles and they desire oratories. So what they want is they want things that are events that are amazing to watch or to contemplate in the case of a story to think about. And then the other thing they want is they want dialogues and monologues that are just simply, powerful in some way. And so all of these things come together. Once you just start putting the pieces together, you start to realize that the stories pretty much write themselves. You just have to get enough pieces together, and then the stories simply write themselves, as long as you're not overly concerned that the whole of the story is super unique, if you know what I mean by that.
What do you mean by that?
Well, so I heard somebody once tell me that there were like 36 different stories or 36 different essential plots. I don't know if that's true. But the idea is that you have archetypical stories. And The Bowl of Tears and Solace is, once you've read it and you reflect upon the story, you may realize that it is actually a particular classical story that has been reworked and essentially modernized, if you will, made new, which is what modern means, new. And for that reason, you, as a writer, you might not have, if you were a writer and you were setting out to write a story like that, you might not have picked it because you might have said to yourself, well, that story's already been done. I want to do a new story. And my approach to storytelling is not the idea that I have to tell this new story, but that there are these repeating stories and themes throughout all time, and that all I'm really doing is just tapping into this sort of muse, if you will, and you sort of get to hear it for a little while in the story. It's the same way as the way poetry works, because I feel like poetry and storytelling are essentially the same art.
Interesting. It's almost like you were entering the battlefield of truth.
Yeah.
Because the same, like, even with like the ancient heresies, and like it's always the same. It's just like the same battle, the retelling of the same lies versus the retelling of the same truths.
Yes. And I think that one of the interesting parts about science fiction is that because you have these layers of technology and future locales and, even aliens and whatever it is, at first it can seem like you're someplace completely new. And then as the layers get peeled away, you realize that the same underlying motivations and the same underlying plots are really going on underneath it. And yeah, there's a person who is out for their own, and then there's a person who is perhaps foolishly trying to help everybody, and so on and so forth. And I mean, it could seem disenchanting, but on the other hand, if the story has the right delivery, it's very satisfying, because then you recognize in yourself, you say, oh, I understand what's going on now. But it's always interesting to see how you get there.
All I know is G1 seems like a great place to live. Sounds.
And that's the other thing that, talking about this realism, Um, whenever I describe locales, especially the ones that I like to have the stories happen in, I try to not make anything too ideal, but I try not to make anything purely dystopian. And so I think that it would be interesting to see how different people interpret the station G1 in terms of its dystopianness versus its utopianness, whether they feel like it would be an okay place to live or why not. In the story, sometimes, well, it's hard to get past there's a certain suspicion that the main character has regarding the station, which sort of colors his experience of it.
That's an interesting, because it's that idea that like the reputation of G1 is like slandered by by Earth because of the difference in government style. Not that I want to give any spoilers away, but they run themselves differently, and we see that in our world today. Governments who operate differently tend to slander and kind of propagandize against each other.
Yeah, and you actually see that going both ways in the story. And the ruler of the person who rules the station has a certain opinion about people from Earth in general, or people not just from Earth, but people who live on Earth. And it's sort of a mirror image of the attitude some of the people from or on Earth have about G1.
Interesting.
But it's done in passing for the most part. I don't spend a lot of time sort of pounding away at it, but almost all of the characters who live in space express some kind of disdain for people who are from or live on Earth, which is interesting because almost everyone you meet who lives in space, not all of them, but many of them actually came from Earth when they were younger anyway. And so they have kind of developed an attitude towards Earth it may or may not, I mean, you don't really get a huge view of what Earth is like at this time. It's like 2120, but they definitely have a negative attitude towards it. And whether that's because once they go to space, they are sort of justifying themselves in space because it's a hard life in space, or if being in space completely changes their perspective of the whole cosmos, and it makes them feel like Earth is sort of like for kids almost. But I don't necessarily go into the complexities of in some of the future stories that might come up if I do write other stories in this particular vein. But it's the sort of the idea of once you live in the heavens, the Earth seems like a paltry thing.
Yeah, it didn't, for whatever reason, the first time I read through, that little dynamic didn't even hit me until I started reading it again, now that it's in a book form.
And I'll tell you something. One of the things I tried to do is I tried to make the story itself simple enough that if you simply read through, you get the story. And then if you read through again, the details about certain relationships like that sort of will emerge to you. And actually, when I reread the story myself, sometimes I discover things that I didn't even realize I put in. So
that's funny. That's like when we were listening to, at least you're not to the point where the proper way to read it is the complete opposite of what your intention was. Like what we learned about Frank Herbert.
Yeah. Well, I think when you set out to prove something in a story, you should probably think out the whole story, feel like it makes sense before you try to write it. And I think maybe with Herbert, he may not have done that. It seems weird to me, but I'll tell you something. There are different ways to write. And so Lewis and Tolkien Lewis wrote in this way where he would start out with an image and he would just write. So the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe allegedly started out with this image of a lion and this lamppost in the middle of the woods, right? And so the lamppost in the middle of the woods is really sort of inexplicable for the majority of the series. And in fact, it's completely irrational. It was just the image that he originally had, and it was sort of the focal point for the original story. And it does end up getting explained in The Magician's Nephew, which is the sixth story. But in their actual order, that little piece of the story was just sort of completely whimsical. It had no bearing on anything at all. And it kind of got retconned into the history because when he was going to explain the history of the world, it ended up being in there. But when you write like that, you do risk, when you start setting up the situations and you start looking at the way the characters would behave, at least as you understand it, you may end up creating an outcome that was not the outcome you wanted. Whereas Tolkien's method was to sort of map everything out to begin with. And so Tolkien knew how things were going to happen. And so Tolkien was unlikely to get a result he didn't like.
Interesting.
But I have no idea how
Herbert
wrote now.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, where can people follow you and where can they find your work?
Well, they can follow me at GTA Ogle, at GTA Ogle on Twitter. And I believe my book is for sale at Saints Edward Media, Saints Edward, so Saints plural, saintsedwardmedia.com. I think it's $14.99 plus tax, whatever the tax happens to be. I think if you're not in our Nexus state, which I guess is Maryland, you don't pay sales tax. I think that's still true. I'm not sure if that law has changed. I do e-commerce stuff for my work, and there was recently some kind of dust up with big companies and states wanting their sales tax. So I don't know about that, but the book is $14.99 plus tax, and it's about 200 pages long. It's short. And these are, I think, the first printing, so it's sort of like, this is the first edition of the book. It's that first print run is unique, and believe me.
Yeah. Well, it's also we have it in one store so far. It's at Curmudgeon's in Glen Burnie,
Nice.
Marley Station Mall. So
Yes.
hopefully more stores pick it up soon.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, well, thanks for coming on, Mr. Ogle. Appreciate it, and get to work right in the next one.
I think I've already got it planned out. All right.
Cool beans. Thank you, sir. You have a good day.
You too.
All right. Nice little interview with Garth T. Ogle. I did, this is what the book looks like. Nice condition, nice matte finish. He's got a great publisher, let me tell you. It's published by Saints Edwards Media, LLC. It really is a good book. It surprised me. I mean, the first time I read it, I breezed through it, and it's just a lot of intrigue and action. So I highly suggest going over to saintsedwardmedia.com. Put in an order. You really won't regret it. Hey, I got nothing else for you. If you like our content, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, please consider supporting our content at Patreon/Britannium Times. See you guys next week.